Good afternoon, everybody. This is Steve Wilson at the Illinois State Water Survey. We're here today to talk about common questions that you all have about private wells. I'm at the State Water Survey at the University of Illinois, and together with a bunch of other folks, we run the private well class, which is a national program funded by EPA and through Rural Community Assistance Partnership, RCAP. And it's a program we run jointly with RCAP nationally to provide education and outreach to well owners and those that serve them, basically. So today we're going to have Dan Webb with me. I'm getting ahead of myself, and Jennifer Wilson. I'll mention them in a second. But I want to, we've started providing CEUs, continuing education credit, for sanitarians who either in Illinois, LEHP credit, or if they're affiliated with NEHA, the National Environmental Health Association. So I put this slide up just to let everyone know that if you're a sanitarian and you're trying to get CEUs today, we do have a certificate of attendance, a copy of the slide deck, and the forms for NEHA that if you go to the handouts tab, you can download those. And the way at least NEHA's credit works is that you can only take the same class once every 2 years. So I listed here on the bottom left or bottom right the other times that we've hosted this basically same content. It is different every time because part of this webinar is answering the questions that you all provided in advance. And so really every webinar is different, at least the questions are, and we update things as we go. So over the last several years, this webinar on common questions has evolved like many of the other things that we've developed as we learn more too. So, moving forward, today is about, I mentioned already, it's part of this national program that we work with RCAP to support private well owners, and it follows the materials from the class we've developed, which is a 10-lesson online free course for well owners and others at privatewellclass.org. We are recording this webinar, and we've recorded all of them in the last 3 or 4 years that we've done this, so they're all available on our website and on YouTube, on our YouTube channel. And so if you want to go back, especially what I would recommend, even the same named webinar, the last half of it is answering questions that folks have asked, and they're usually different. And so there's still valuable information there. If you want to go back and look through those, a lot of common questions that we answer because we only have so much time. I think we had around, 90 to 100 questions this time, and we'll probably answer about 15 of those at the end of the webinar here, just because of time and what that takes. So you can always email us at info@privatewellclass.org. with follow-up, or if you have something that comes up today as we're going through this webinar and there's a question that comes up in your mind, we will respond. So thank you for being here today. I do want to point out, and this will come up later, there's a question about funding for fixing treatment or a well and that sort of thing. RCAP, the Rural Community Assistance Partnership, is made up of these 6 regional affiliates, and they have staff in every state. So I'm going to mention this later, but RCAC, Great Lakes RCAP, and Southeast RCAP all are part of the USDA program to provide low-cost loans to well owners for basically fixing their well or putting in a well. And I'll mention that later, but RCAP also has part of our program, what their staff are doing is boots on the ground type efforts. So if you have a problem, or if you're interested in having this the vulnerability of your well assessed, RCAP staff can come out and meet with you one-on-one and do those things. And they've done about 1,100 of these assessments across the country already. And with the funding we have from EPA, they're going to continue to do that over the next several years. So, and you can always contact us again if to give you a contact at any of these regional affiliates for whatever state you may be in. So a little bit about us real quick, because I think it's important to set the stage for why we're involved with this. So the Illinois State Water Survey started in the 1890s because of cholera and typhoid outbreaks in Illinois. So it was this building that's next to this placard that's up at the University of Illinois campus is Noyes Lab, which is a chemistry building, and that's where Arthur Palmer started the State Water Survey. So we've been around for over 100 years. We house all the state's well logs. So in Illinois, we have about 500,000 well logs from private well owners and community water supplies, irrigators, self-supplied industries, anyone that uses water in Illinois. And so part of my job as a groundwater hydrologist at the State Water Survey is to answer questions from Illinois well owners or to help them understand, or communities understand, issues about their water supplies. So we also have a public service lab, which until 2008, I believe, offered free water analysis to any well owner in Illinois for inorganics and metals. And so now there's a charge for that, but it's still highly subsidized. I think it's only $35 or $50, where normally that would cost at a private lab probably 4 or 5 times that amount. So our mission, if you will, at the state, as a sort of a state agency, we're a sister agency to our State Geological Survey and Natural History Survey, is to do outreach, education, research, and provide long-term data collection. We have some data that go back on water quality and water level information close to 100 years. So that's who we are. And just as an example, one of my staff is actually going through all our historical data and community well log information, and keeps running across data like this that shows the city of Pana in 1916. This is a typhoid outbreak, and that was mapped, and samples were taken, and all that sort of stuff. So we've been in the health and water quality and groundwater game for a long time, and I've been here nearly 30 years. It's a great place to work as far as we get to help a lot of people, and we're very fortunate that through RCAP we're able to do this now on a national scale. So about today, as I said, I'm a groundwater hydrologist at the Water Survey. Jennifer Wilson's here today. She's a communications coordinator for both our water operator and private well class programs. And Dan Webb, who's the manager of our public service lab, is here. Anything related to chemistry or sampling or those things, he's the guy that I go to, and he'll answer a lot of those questions today. So the thing to remember as a private well owner is that, community water supplies are regulated by the Safe Drinking Water Act. That means the community has to test, have a licensed operator, ensure that the water that comes to your home is safe. So if you're on a private well, because they're not regulated, you are the water operator for your very small water supply. And it's really up to you to make sure that your water is safe to drink, that your system's maintained, that everything works properly, and more importantly, when something goes wrong, that you have the wherewithal to get it fixed or to fix it, or to find an alternate water supply. So the other thing to note is that well water and groundwater can be the safest and best tasting in the world, but it can also contain contaminants that are odorless, colorless, and don't have any taste. So the only way to ensure that your well water is safe is to test it, which is what your community water supply has to do on a regular basis to meet all the regulations for the Safe Drinking Water Act. So I grew up in an old dug well, 14 feet deep. When it rained really hard, we had cloudy water for several days. So that means it's not safe because stuff from the surface can get in our well. But now I live in the Champaign-Urbana area on a community water supply, and I pay $40 to $50 a month to my community water supply, and that cost is spread out over the 150,000 residents or so that all use our water, so that our community water supply can do the sampling and have the staff and fix broken pipes and all those things to ensure that the water when I turn on my tap is safe. But you as a private well owner, that is all your responsibility for your water supply to protect your family and yourself. So it's really a responsibility. We run across a lot of folks who really understand those issues and do maintain their wells properly and understand why they need to sample. We also run across well owners who don't even necessarily know for sure if they have a well or where it's at, or that they've never tested it. And so our job is to help you understand why it's important that you do those things. So it is about being aware and understanding your well. So if there's a well log for your well, you should know where it's at, get a copy from the state if it's available, and understand what it means, what the geology means on the log, how deep your pump set, what that means, if you have a screen or not, if it's a sand and gravel well, and what all the implications of that are. And if you go through our class, a lot of that's explained in a lot more detail. I mentioned the 10 lessons, more than we can do today. We're going to spend most of today just talking about questions you've asked. You also need to know if there are naturally occurring contaminants or any other water quality issues associated with your well or your water source. That means you could have an aquifer where your water's coming from that has naturally occurring arsenic in it. Or I'll show you some examples later of some other constituents that might be in just the natural makeup of the earth materials and the geology that mean you need to sample and be sure that you're not putting your family at risk. So the other objective of our class and webinars and all the materials we provide is to help you learn enough about your well that you're able to ask better questions and the right questions, and that you understand who to contact in your local area for the right sources of information. I don't know everything about every county or every state in the union. And so a lot of times when somebody calls me and asks a specific question that's geology related or local water quality related, I find the person in their area that they need to contact. And so by going through this lesson and these classes, it'll help you understand who you can contact and what their role is and why you shouldn't be scared to contact them, but instead they should be there to help you, and you should rely on them and use them. So and the last thing is sample your well. It's estimated that between 65 and 75% of well owners have never tested their well. You'll see today we recommend you sample it every year for at least coliform and nitrate, and every so many years for a lot of other things, so that you understand what your water chemistry is, and it shouldn't change in most cases. It should be very consistent because groundwater moves slow enough that a deeper aquifer especially should have pretty consistent water quality. We always get a lot of questions about testing and sampling, and so here's just a laundry list of some of the things that we've got. I'm going to try to go through these. So where do you collect the sample? Well, it depends. If a lab sends you the sample kit, or if you go into a lab to get a sample kit, they should provide instructions that talk to you about either letting the water run or why you should sample both at your kitchen sink and your outside tap. I've said here, water coming out of your kitchen sink could be chemically different from the water at your outside tap, and that's because maybe you have a softener or a filter or an RO unit, or you have certain kinds of pipes like lead pipes if it's an older home that could cause water that sits in those pipes overnight to leach some of those materials. And so by sampling from an outside tap that's before any kind of treatment or before your indoor or premise plumbing, you can get an idea of what the groundwater quality is coming in, as well as what your drinking water quality is at your tap. So as it says here at the bottom, a good lab will provide detailed instructions. You should be able to call the lab and ask questions, and they should be able to answer them. But one of the things is where to sample, and we do recommend that you try to collect two. It gives you a lot more information if you have one that's before any kind of treatment, and if you have any treatment devices, or if your piping in your home is from an older home, then this is another good reason. So as far as what to test for, it really depends on a lot of factors. There's a certain set of constituents that we're going to recommend, but that's in general for everyone in the country. And one of the things that I want to stress is that you should contact your county or state or local health department and ask them what to test for, because it does matter. Some areas have other kinds of natural occurring constituents, or there may be certain things going on in the area that may affect your water quality. And so understanding, knowing the depth of your well, the formation, meaning the geologic formation your water is coming from, and if there are any known naturally occurring contaminants in the area, or there was ever a spill or a Superfund site or whatever, all those things certainly matter. And so it's not a set list for anyone, but if you have a very deep well with that's properly constructed and it's cased to a significant depth, then you're less likely to have surface influence. And so there's things like that help dictate what you should do. And as I said at the bottom here, sample for coliform and nitrate annually. So coliform bacteria isn't the harmful bacteria. It comes from our bodies, but it's not necessarily going to cause health issues. It's E. coli that causes those problems. But you shouldn't have coliform bacteria in your well either. So the reason we test for coliform and nitrate annually is because it's very cheap to do, and it also indicates that there's a pathway from outside your well to inside your well. You shouldn't have high nitrate, and you shouldn't have coliform bacteria unless there's a way for those things to get in your well. It could be from two different causes. One could be that there's an actual breach in your well, or it's a very shallow well that doesn't have casing to protect it from surface influence, like an old hand-dug well, or it could be a PVC well that's got a crack in the casing, or even a steel well or iron well that maybe wasn't welded properly. And that's one way for that to happen. The other is if your source aquifer actually has a pathway with it. So you could have your well in a shallow aquifer. It turns out that there's a feedlot or a septic system that's contaminating that aquifer or some other source. And then when you start pumping your well, water gets drawn through the aquifer towards your well and eventually will contaminate it. So either way, you need to do something about it. And so it's a matter of this is a simple way to ensure that those things aren't going to happen. So as an example, this is Rhode Island. They have it on their Department of Health website. The little dots on this are where there used to be orchards, which back in the day, they used a lot of arsenic as a pesticide and insecticide for these orchards. And so some of these areas have significant soil contamination of arsenic, but it also leaches into the groundwater. And so they've identified these areas as if you're near an old orchard, you should probably consider testing for arsenic. And if you're in Rhode Island, the best thing to do there would be to contact the Department of Health. And then if you can see this, sometimes it doesn't show up real well, but there's a big splotch in the middle third of the screen of the state of Rhode Island. That is naturally occurring and high and elevated beryllium. I'm a groundwater scientist. I have been for over 30 years. And until I saw this figure, I didn't even know beryllium was a regulated contaminant. It's so rarely found that it's generally not over any kind of health threshold. But here in Rhode Island, they have naturally occurring beryllium, and it is a health-based contaminant. It's got an MCL, which means maximum contaminant level allowed by law in the Safe Drinking Water Act. So any communities in these areas have to treat to remove beryllium below that health standard. And so you as a private well owner would need to do the same or find out at least if it's high or not. So this is one of the reasons why I say you need to talk to a local source. They're going to know this in Rhode Island, where most of us in the country would have no idea that you need to be concerned about beryllium because it's such a rare occurring thing. Another example here is Massachusetts. On their website, Massachusetts DEP has the site set up where you can type in your address, and it'll tell you if you have a risk of arsenic or uranium. It's all naturally occurring, again, just as part of the makeup of the bedrock. But if you put in your address and it says you might be at risk, then you know you should probably test for those things. And there's links here to certified labs that can test for that in the area. So they're trying to be to give guidance and help well owners understand what their risks might be. And lastly, we're starting to see more sites like this. This is a GIS mapping feature that this has been put up by the University of Stevens Point in Wisconsin, but they're under contract from Wisconsin DNR, and their Department of Natural Resources is the primacy agency in Wisconsin, and they maintain a water quality database on private wells. So I went over to the right top here and clicked on arsenic by county, and so what it's showing me is for those counties where they have at least multiple samples where they see higher arsenic. And so you can see in the Green Bay area, there's 3 counties there where the average detected arsenic in a private well sample has been over 21 parts per billion, or micrograms per liter, where the health standard for a community water supply is 10. So it gives you an idea. If I was going to buy a home in Wisconsin, I would want to look at this. You can look at nitrate, other sources, other types of constituents, and it gives you an idea of what might be there. And like I said, more and more states are going to start going to some of these more open applications where you can see if there's a risk or not, so you know. And it's really a valuable resource for you as a well owner. And I don't know if you notice here, but there's a few counties where there's no color at all. They're clear. That means they have no samples in those counties. So, but it's a really useful resource if you live in Wisconsin. So here's what we suggest. As I mentioned, sample for coliform bacteria and nitrate annually. The idea, again, is to, not that those things are necessarily harmful to you directly. Nitrate is certainly a problem for pregnant mothers and babies under 6 months old, which you can find more information about that if you just Google US EPA MCL, and it lists information about all the primary drinking water contaminants. But then we also recommend this list of things that are listed, that are shown here: fluoride, iron, lead, arsenic, chloride, turbidity. Those give you an idea of the general chemistry of your water, and especially knowing pH and some of these other properties, a chemist can tell you if the water might be corrosive or not. pH isn't the only indicator of corrosiveness. You can have water with a pH over 7 that's still corrosive based on some of these other properties. And it's just a good idea to understand, even for treating your water, if you have very hard water and you're going to look at a treatment dealer to add, or maybe you want to add some kind of filter, having this information will help determine what you need for those things. So, and again, get advice from your local or state health department, because they're the experts. They're also the health experts, which we're not, and they can provide you information on anything that they suggest might be worthwhile to test for. So I'm going to show an example here of why we sample for both an inside and outside sample, if you will, one in an outside spigot before any treatment and one after. This is a home in Muhammad. It's about 15 minutes from Champaign. This well owner, this is the outside spigot, so it says the treatment. If you look at up at the top, it says treatment, and it's blank. And this was done in 2015. But the turbidity is 29.8 on the right side, the color is 48.1, the pH is 8.02, and further below, the hardness is 351. On the left side, where it says sodium, right at the bottom of the first group of constituents or parameters, it says 25.9. So that's the natural water quality of this well. And anything with a less than sign means it was below detection for the water surveys lab. So if you take this through, then there's a filter. He has a filter and a softener, an iron, just a regular 5-micron filter. You can see what's changed here. The hardness went from 351 to 0.68. The sodium went from 25 to 198. So he's using regular sodium-based salt for his softener. And if you're on a low sodium diet, you might not realize even what kind of changes this is causing to the chemistry of your water. But the hardness has gone down, the turbidity and color have really gone down, and so those units, the filter and the softener, are doing their job. They're making the water less turbid, less hard, all the things you'd want when you're on a groundwater supply. So he also added a RO unit, and so he took a sample after the RO unit, which, it's Dan can explain that more later in the questions if somebody asks, but you can see almost everything is below detection limit now, because an RO unit takes almost everything out of the water. But the one consequence of that is the things that are in there that help buffer the water and maintain the pH are now gone. So the pH went from 8.02 down to 6.23. And again, in Illinois, that's not such a big deal. That's not very acidic. But if you start with source water or groundwater that's not at 8, say it's at 5.5 or 6, like the Piedmont Aquifer in Virginia, then using an RO unit may reduce that even more, and it can affect how corrosive the water might be. So I like to show this example, and I show it to not only to the well owners, but to sanitarians and everybody else, because it's a great example of how understanding how your treatment works and how it can affect your water chemistry, the water you're actually drinking. And this is a groundwater system that's a well that's 240 feet deep in a sand and gravel aquifer. So the screen is down near the bottom. So the water's coming from like 236 to 240 feet below land surface, which means it's very protected from any kind of source influence. So this is the natural groundwater that we're looking at. So when do you test your well? You should test it anytime it's been opened, once, besides once a year is what this means here, I guess. Anytime you've disinfected. So if you've had a bacteria problem and you've shot chlorinated your well, then before you start drinking it, you should test it again and make sure it's actually done its job, and make sure it's safe to drink. And anytime there's been any kind of emergency issue, like this is from I think Jefferson County, Colorado, where they sent us a bunch of pictures of some of the wells after a forest fire had gone through. And you can see that the aluminum cap has been melted and all the wiring's melted together. So, I mean, there's, it's a whole nother set of issues, but if you're in an area that's prone to a fire, you need to make sure you turn off your power before you leave, because those melted wires could start your pump, even though you might not want it to be. So things like that. As far as getting it analyzed, every state accredits labs that have shown that they have done their due diligence and they're using the right methods and they collect everything the right way, so that communities can use those labs to get their compliance samples for the Safe Drinking Water Act completed. Some states have their own programs from their own lab for private well sampling. I know our state public health department tests for coliform. But a good lab will give you detailed sampling instructions, explain how to store and preserve the sample if it needs to be in ice or whatever, and also tell you when it has to be back so that it meets the criteria. For coliform, there's only a short holding period, for instance. So ask a lot of questions is what we recommend, and they should be able to provide everything for you. And if they can't, I recommend you find another lab. And I do want to say one thing. Our lab used to be accredited by EPA, but the costs based on the number of samples we do made that prohibitive at some point. So we're no longer a state accredited lab as far as compliance sampling, but we follow all the methods and everything else. And so there's a number of universities that have similar labs to ours, Virginia Tech, Texas A&M, a few others, that provide quality analysis. It's just not a defendable sample. It wouldn't be defendable in court, for instance. So still good information. As far as interpreting results, you get a lab report back from a lab. Sometimes we just had a meeting with the Association of Public Health Labs about this issue. That lab reports are sometimes confusing, that sort of thing, or the units are different and may not be in the units that the MCLs are in, for instance. So there are websites and a lot of online documents that you can look at to get a sense of your results, and I'm going to show you a really good one that was a state developed. But I would always take your sample to a health department and ask them to give you a qualified answer. What does this mean? Does this matter? And they either know the answer or they can find someone who can give you the right answer, so that you're confident that the water you're drinking is safe to drink. And we also recommend, if you find something in your well, resample, because sometimes labs make mistakes, or the way the sample is collected caused, especially for coliform, sometimes even something on your hands can get in there, and or something on the end of you brush the end of the spigot with the bottle, it could slough something off, that sort of thing. And if you do have bacteria or coliform, then you should also test for E. coli to make sure you don't have E. coli. And I'd boil your water before and make sure it's been chlorinated or disinfected, I should say there instead of chlorinate, before you drink it again. So this is the guide I just mentioned. the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services developed this Be Well Informed guide, and this was developed for the residents in New Hampshire, but it works for anyone. And we actually had them come talk at our conference last May and show how this works and how they developed it. And it's really a great tool to use as a way for you to understand what your sample results mean. So when you go to this website, and you can just Google Be Well Informed Guide, there's a green button down there that says enter your water test results. And so when you go to do that, I typed in 15 micrograms per liter. And so there's a drop down, so whatever unit your lab provides your results in, you can go in and click on those results so you're making sure you're doing the right thing. Some older versions of these types of tools required you to put things in milligrams per liter. And when you start converting numbers, those of us that haven't been in high school in a long time sometimes have trouble making those conversions and putting the wrong numbers in. So to me, this one advantage with the units makes this a much better tool. So you put in 15, which the health standard is 10 micrograms per liter, and then you hit submit. And so it comes up with the red X, and it says the value exceeds the drinking water limit. And then the other nice advantage to this particular tool is that it also recommends types of treatment. So really, these are the two types of treatments for a home system. POU means point of use, and it's either going to be an absorptive media system or it's going to be an RO system, a reverse osmosis. And that's generally how you remove arsenic. So if someone tries to sell you some other kind of tool or treatment device, you have some idea that this is really what you need if that's what you have. And I only entered one constituent, arsenic. If you have a full set of lab analysis, you should enter all in, because sometimes it might make a difference on whether one of these types of treatment might be preferred over the other, depending on the other constituents in your water. So then it also gives you an interpretation and tells you that as far as treatment, there's two NSF ANSI standards. One's for RO and one's for absorptive media. And so when you go out to look for a treatment device, then you'd want to find one that has a stamp on it that says certified standard 53 or 58, depending on what you're doing. There's a lot of treatment devices out there, and some of them aren't certified or haven't gone through that certification process, and they may say they remove arsenic, but they may not actually do a very good job. They're generally cheaper, but you get what you pay for. And so, but if it's been certified through the NSF ANSI standard process, then you have some confidence that it's actually going to do its job and remove arsenic out of your water. So again, I want to mention that these tools are a guide. They're meant to help you for typical water. I would always take your sample results to your health department and get a qualified answer. Like I said, they're the health professionals and really want to make sure that your water is safe to drink to protect you and your family. And it's the same mission we all share, but it's better to get a second opinion than trust something on the web. So they can't tell you to stop drinking your water or condemn your well. They can only recommend it. So I leave this in here. But as I've worked around the country, I have found a few local health districts and a few counties, especially the Northeast, where that's not true. There's a few local health jurisdictions in Massachusetts where if your water is bad enough and you can't treat it, they can condemn your well. But in most states, they can't do that. So, I understand some people are hesitant to even go to their county or local health department because they don't want them to tell them they can't. It's still true almost everywhere that they can't tell you to stop drinking your water. We have cases here in Illinois where we found 50 to 150 ppb of arsenic, and the person who lives there is maybe elderly, and they're like, I've drank this my entire life, it hasn't killed me yet, I think I'll just keep drinking it. And that's their prerogative because they're on a private well. So I wouldn't want my kids or my grandkids to do that, even if I was stubborn enough to do that, but that's up to the individual. So the other piece, there's really two parts to most water quality problems with private wells. and probably the main one is poor well construction. So because now we have well construction code in every state but two, things are better for new wells. They have to meet certain requirements so that they are more protective at the surface. But like the well I grew up on was an old hand-dug well that my grandfather hand-dug in 1933. It's only 14 feet deep. It's in a ravine, so water runs from the surface towards it from both sides, and it's uncemented brick, which means water can come in at a few inches below land surface, let alone, even going through a few feet of soil to help take out certain things. So we also have many wells that are in pits. Those were originally done before the invention of the pitless adapter, and so in colder climates, you had your well down in a pit so that in the winter the pipes didn't freeze. If it was below the frost line, that protected it from doing so. But today, in colder climates, we use a pitless adapter, which is just a unit that sits down in the well and allows you to have all the piping and everything down at 4 feet or so that you don't have to worry about that, and you still have a casing that comes to the surface so that you don't have a pit that you have to get into. Pits are terrible because people die in those because of lack of oxygen and falling in there, or they fill with water and that surface water's seeping into your well because your well cap isn't completely sealed. So they're not only a source of surface contamination, but they're also a safety hazard. So here's two examples. The one on the left is from the Washington State Department of Ecology. They have a blog, and they are the primacy agency for well construction and drillers licensing in Washington State. So their job is to ensure that well owners are licensed and that drillers are following the construction code in their state. And so they've got this nice blog where they post pictures and stories to help people understand the issues around private wells. So there's a piece of plywood over this large galvanized pipe well. It's just a conduit, if you will. And you can see that there was a concrete block that fit over that hole, and it broke, and the woman died. So, but there's a broom there and an old funnel, and that looks like insulation, possibly, that's laying around there that can all fall in the well. Depending on how sealed this building is, you could have rats and mice. They can all fall in. It's just a really bad situation and not the way you want your drinking water to be. And on the left, or on the right here, this is an old dug well in southern Illinois. I ran into Don at an event I was at, and he had these pictures. That's a goat. It fell in the well, and no one knew it for quite a while. And if you can imagine, they've got a concrete pipe here on top, but below you can see those bricks. That's an old hand-dug brick well. So it's surprising how often some of these things happen, and people don't realize it. So what should you do with these wells? Bring them up to code if you can. And there's differences. So not every piece of well code, the code that they have to follow today is as critical as others. So someone with some wherewithal should take a look at your well and help you determine if there's a problem. And an example would be if your well is only 12 feet above ground surface, so the pipe only comes up 12 inches, and the code in your state says it should be 18 inches, you probably don't need to raise it the 6 inches to meet code. That's there so that if there's ever a flooding instance, your well is up high enough that it's not going to be flooded. And so if your well is in a low spot that's prone to flooding, then maybe you do need to do something to raise it up, add a section of pipe so that it's higher. We see wells in floodplains that sometimes have 10 or 15 feet of standpipe, and it's welded all the way up to the top of that. They have to use a ladder to get to the top of their well, and that's because they know it can flood, and they don't want bacteria and things to get in their well. So, and if it's in a pit, extend the pipe to the surface, fill that pit in, and install pitless if you need to, if you're in a cold climate. But, talk to someone who's an authority, a contractor, or someone, even extension agent, probably county extension could help you understand what you need to do in order to make that well more safe. Along with that are abandoned wells. So, well logs weren't required in most states until at least the 60s to 80s. In some states, much later than that. And so what we find is there's a lot more wells that aren't on file, even at the water survey where the state required well logs to be filed since 1968, than there are wells that are on file. So we have about 500,000 well logs in our files, and we estimate that there's between 800,000 and 1 million wells in use in Illinois. So we don't have records for a lot of wells. And even then, those are wells that are in use. There could be as many wells that are abandoned that are no longer being used. And a lot of times those are the older, most vulnerable wells. And so if you have one of these on your property, the reason you want to fill it in and follow the guidelines where you're filling it in with clay and or bentonite, so that you prevent water from getting through it down to the aquifer, is, if somebody falls in that well and it's on your property, I don't care if they're supposed to be there or not, in most cases you're going to be liable. And if someone gets killed, that's even that much worse. But it can also contaminate the aquifer that you and maybe a lot of your neighbors are using for water supply. And you'd be surprised how many times people see an old well or don't understand it's an old well and think, oh, this would be a great place to dump something. And a great example of that is we found, Western Illinois University is in Macomb, Illinois, which is a town, I think, between 15 and 20,000 people. Someone bought a house there and realized that they had an old dug well in their backyard. And this is in town where they've had public water since 1916. And it was a concrete pad with a small hole in the middle where a hand pump used to be. So we were asked by the geology department there to help with a demonstration to show how to properly abandon that well. And so we went over there and we videotaped the whole thing, and you can get to that video on our website, but how to properly abandon it. And when we took the concrete pad off the top, there were about 10,000 cigarette butts down in that well and several lighters. So the previous owner had saw that small hole and decided that was a great place to throw his cigarette butts when he went outside to smoke. So there's a lot of things that can happen, and it's a natural tendency, and that's why we should fill those things in. Here's some examples. Again, the two pictures are both from the State of Washington Department of Ecology's blog. There's a horse in a well, and in the bottom picture, firemen are pulling a man out of a well. He wasn't hurt, surprisingly. He fell 45 feet, and he must have hit water, because otherwise I don't think he'd have been very well to come out of there, but he didn't get hurt at all. So these newspaper clippings are kind of old. They're from the 90s, but 3 of those are from Illinois, the first, second, and fourth one. And the third one is Jessica McClure, who's a little 18-month-old who got stuck in a well in Texas. It was covered live on CNN, if you're old enough to remember that. I think that was like in 95 maybe, or 97. And so they're all just examples of this happens more than people think. And these old abandoned wells need to be sealed. So yeah, enough said. So quickly, I want to talk a little bit about the private well class and our program, and then I'm going to get to all your questions. Dan and I are. So the private well class, it's the URL is privatewellclass.org, and it's 10 lessons. It's self-paced. You sign up with your email address, and it starts sending you a lesson once a week. It's a PDF. So you don't have to do it, but you have the material. It's, the idea is you read through it over the week, and then you get another one the next week. And it just feeds on itself, and it walks you through. It starts out how water gets into a well and how water flows through the ground, and it ends up with talking about treatment issues and how to protect yourself and some of those things. And in the middle, common problems, how to find local information, and a lot of really useful information for you as a well owner that can serve as a resource both while you go through the lesson and later on when you have issues come up with your well. So this is the front page of the website, and you click on Learn by Email on the bottom left, and it takes you to a page where you can sign up. We also have audio podcasts and videos that are both these short videos I'll show you in a second, as well as the recorded webinars like the one we're doing today. And there's a lot of other resources under Resource Library. So if we clicked on Resource Library, under each of the 10 lessons, we've listed a bunch of other resources that are available from other folks and other organizations that'll help you understand what we've provided better. Each lesson is between 6 and 10 pages, and honestly, that's seems like a lot, but it isn't very much space to cover a good comprehensive series of information on each of these topics. So we've included additional information and links to each of these different handbooks and guides, so to explain, what aquifers are and all those sort of things. Or if you have a flowing well, Michigan has a flowing well handbook that's really extensive. Or if you have a spring, Penn State has a great document talking about how to deal with springs and why you need a spring box and why you probably need to disinfect and some of those issues. So for each of the 10 lessons, there's the set of additional materials that you can go through on your own, and it'll help you understand your well and your situation better. And in some cases, it may be a document from your university, your state university, or your state agency, or even a county agency in some cases. We do webinars like the one we're in today. We did one in August of 2016 on lead, and I point that out because we put a lot of resources into developing that so that well owners would understand if they have an older home or they're worried about lead in their premise plumbing. This gives you a lot of answers to those questions, a lot more than I could do today trying to answer someone's question about lead. So there's this video that's I don't know if it's 60 to 90 minutes long. We used resources from EPA and from some universities like Virginia Tech and some of the things they've learned about private wells. And we also put all of that then on a resources page. So under Resource Library, you can find this page on lead in drinking water, and it gives you links to, EPA and CDC. A lot of good, what kind of water filters and what we know about that, and how to search for those things. It's just meant to be a resource that'll help you, if you spend the time going through it, understand what issues might be for you, depending on where you live, what type of aquifer you have, what kind of well construction you have. A drop pipe for your pump, if it's made out of galvanized pipe, that's a source of lead, depending on the water quality in your well. So there's a lot of things here that are useful to you as a well owner to understand if you might have any kind of lead issues. So I mentioned these short training videos. You can see up here under categories, it says training videos 16. I know Katie Buckley just finished one on septic systems, so now there's 17 of them, I believe. But these are all on practical issues that you as a well owner need to understand. One that a lot of people don't understand is if you're on a shared well. So in Illinois, we had a time where to not have to sample a well as part of the Safe Drinking Water Act, community water supply is considered 15 connections or 25 people. So a lot of developers put in one well for every 5 or 7 homes, and so that they could stay under that. But at the same time, they've really done a disservice to all those homeowners, because now those 5 to 7 landowners all have to share a well. They all have to get along, even though one of them has it on their property and the others don't. I have a coworker here who bought a house out in the country where there's 3 homes. She didn't realize that they all have one well, and it's not on her property. So, what do you need to do about that? Well, it depends on what state you're in, but if I'm going to buy a home and I'm going to share a well, I'm going to make sure that it's either in my deed or there's a written contract with the other people who are using that well, so that someone can't buy the property where the well is and take it away from me. So there's a lot of issues on things like that. What do I do if my well goes dry? How does my pressure tank work? There's just a lot of really useful short videos, and if you click on training videos, it'll give you the list of the 16 that are there, and they're also on our YouTube channel. We've developed some podcasts for the first 3 lessons. That's 1, 2, and 3 on that list. And then we've done a number of interviews for RFD Illinois, which is the Farm Bureau radio channel, on different topics that they've asked us to come talk about, and they've graciously allowed us to take those recordings and put them on our website. So we hope to develop more of those. They're actually a lot of work, and so we haven't had time to do more of those, but we plan to in the future. So the goal of our program overall is really to help well owners understand why their well is important, why they need to understand how it works, and how and what they can do to protect themselves from risk related to their water quality. And so going through our class helps you do that. As a well owner, we certainly recommend you do more than just do the webinars. We have a number of people who've contacted us and said, oh, your webinars are great, Well, thank you. And we put a lot into them, so that's great. But you need to go through the class. It's free. There's no reason not to take it. And it gives you a lot of additional information that we can't do in our 60 to 90 minutes here. So, so now we're going to go through the questions that were submitted, or some of them. And as I've said here, we received a lot of questions. Again, I think it was around 90 to 100 questions this time, and we can't answer all of them. Some people ask more than one, but we took the ones we had as of last Friday, I think, and we went through some of those and tried to answer them. We are developing a web page that'll have all of the questions that we received from our webinars and emails. It's kind of an FAQ up soon, and we've actually got it done. We just haven't launched it. We have a little quality control to do, but it'll be really extensive and a lot of good information. That'll be a way you can search through and find information on a particular topic. So, and I want to mention that Jennifer's on the call today to take your questions. So if you have a question from what I've said so far, or a follow-up to something as we get through these questions that Dan and I are going to answer, then you can go to the question or the chat box and type a question, and Jennifer will add those to a document that we share online, and I'll pull it up at the end, and we can address those questions as well. And we've already got one asking about a well inside the home. So things not to do. So one of the questions was, what things shouldn't you do when your property is on a private well? Really it comes down to common sense, because what wouldn't you do if it was going to endanger anything else? You shouldn't dump, store, or use anything that can contaminate your well. Even if you don't have a well, as I just said, you should really follow the same advice. An aquifer for a community supply could be under your property. They're fairly extensive in a lot of cases, and what you do could harm somebody else. And so I guess the best way to describe this, though, about what you should and shouldn't do, most states have guidelines for wells or setbacks for a new well. So you have to have it so far away from your septic tank, and it has to be so far away from this. And so it also depends on your well, though. If it's in a sensitive geology, or if it's a really shallow well, then those things are much more likely to cause a problem with your well than if you have a deeper well that's well protected and it has casing down to a significant depth. So it's where those things aren't in place that surface contamination can be much more of an issue. And so what I've done is in our class we use a setbacks from the Minnesota Department of Health, and I'm just going to show you that real quick. So this is the top half of a page about what they require whenever you put in a new well. And the point of this isn't the numbers, the 35, 20, or 50 that they require, because every state's different for a new well, but it's to understand that all these things could have an impact on your well. And so you need to understand what those things are. And so this is a really good comprehensive list of the type of things that might be able to impact your well depending on your well type and depth where your water is coming from. And so they're all things that you should avoid having near your well. And here's the bottom half of that diagram. Some things just make sense. We've run across, it says animal feedlot here, 100 feet. We've ran across wells that are in the middle of a feedlot. It's got a concrete casing that comes up out of the ground 3 feet with a pad on top of it. And somehow over time they've managed to put a feedlot around their well. But they've got cattle in there. And I'm not talking about pasture with grass. I'm talking about a feedlot where the cattle are standing in 3 inches of mud. And their well's right next to that. So common sense is really the key to all this, and realizing that you could have things near your well that are influencing your water quality. So the next question, and Dan, are you online?
Yeah, I'm online, Steve.
All right, so feel free to jump in whenever here, but so as a homeowner, how would I know if my well was at risk for arsenic? Arsenic's naturally occurring, and if you have it in your well, it's likely because it's in the makeup of the aquifer and the geology that you have. So it's the 7th most common element in the Earth's crust. First thing I would do is contact your local health department or state resource agency, and I've listed some, a lot of different, DEQ, Department of Environmental Quality, Department of Natural Resources, Environmental Conservation, DOH, Department of Health, and ask if they know of any occurrence in your area. Like the Massachusetts example we showed earlier, most of the time they're going to know, yeah, this aquifer tends to have arsenic in it, in southwest, part of our state or whatever. Another great resource is your state geological survey. In Illinois, you'd contact the water survey, but no other state has a water survey, but every state has a geological survey. So they map the geology in the aquifers, and a lot of times they have water quality sections as part of their unit where they know the natural water quality throughout the state. And between those, and the thing is here is to not be scared to call. The State Geological Survey, like the State Water Survey, is not a regulatory agency. We're a research and outreach and education agency. So our job is to help people understand. We have no authority to do anything regulatory to anyone with a well. And so you can call and be confident that they have your best interests, and they really just want you to understand what's going on and educate you about the geology of your area. So, and I've already mentioned those websites. Anything to add, Dan? I think, that's pretty self-explanatory.
Yeah, that's a pretty good answer. That's a good answer.
Right. So these are yours.
We get a lot of questions that are basically similar to this first one, sulfur smells or rotten egg smells. Generally, they consider the level that's found in drinking water for hydrogen sulfide to be not a health concern. The water, it's not a regulated parameter, and if it were to get to, I don't even know, 100 or 1,000 times what you might find in groundwater, basically before it got there, the water becomes so undrinkable, unpalatable that people will not drink it. So they don't consider it a high risk for hydrogen sulfide. Another question that's really common is high iron. It turns my water brown, orange, various shades, different colors. Sometimes it can turn things black. It's also not something that generally has a health effect associated with it. It's regulated under the secondary contaminants by the US EPA. They're not enforceable standards, but they're monitored for cosmetic reasons, taste, color, odors, things like that.
Okay. Yeah, this is yours too.
Okay. People often have questions about the pros and cons of different types of filtration and treatment systems. And there are a lot of things out there. Some things are more gimmicky, some things aren't, and it's a big task to maybe give just a generalization for everything. So there's a couple of good websites out there that you can go to if you want to look up, something for your specific situation. And a lot of times we'll get questions about what exact model should I buy or what brand should I buy. There are some generalities like softeners. If you have hard water and iron, softeners will usually get rid of that, and along with some other things that can be taken out by ion exchange. But if you do have any questions, these two websites that Steve has listed, one by NSF, that's a good site if you want to look up specific models. They do list brands there, things that they certify for different removal of different parameters. The EPA also has a drinking water treatability database. You can, if you're interested in a specific contaminant, you can look there, or you can, if you want to do like what this person is asking, like, hey, what does this overall treatment process do? You can look at the review of that treatment process.
Yeah, and I'll mention that that New Hampshire tool gives you some idea too if you already have a water quality sample and you're wondering what to treat for, just as an initial idea. But I'd go to all of those things, and we also talk about how different types of treatment systems work, like what distillation does and what RO does in lesson 10 of our class. So if you go through our class, you'll get some of that information as well and help you understand how they should be used and so on.
Thanks, Steve. Sorry, I didn't mean to gloss over that part of the slide. I was just
It's all good. It's all
making
good.
sure I pointed out the websites there.
Yeah, no, and we can make those websites available. Just email us, or yeah, it's probably the best thing. Okay, so treating hard water.
Yeah, this is another really common question. Somebody asked if a water softener is the best way to treat hard water. I was guessing yes, probably. I'll say it's certainly the most common There are other ways. You can do other softening systems, but typically it's a softener as the home solution. But just be aware that it's going to add sodium. So if you're on a low sodium diet, I think they usually recommend having less than 20 milligrams per liter of sodium in your water. It's not an enforceable standard. It's not a standard at all, actually. But there are guidelines set at 20 milligrams per liter. Softeners around here, at least where the water is considered hard or very hard, you're going to see an increase of about a couple hundred parts per million of sodium. So if your background water is 20, you might see softened water at 200, something like that. They do sell potassium chloride salt. I think it's typically more expensive, about 4 times. Like if it's $5 for a bag of sodium chloride, it might be $20 for a bag of potassium chloride. I haven't actually shopped for it recently, but if you do use potassium chloride, then your potassium is going to increase, not sodium.
Yeah, and I would add that if you're on a low sodium diet, then you should take a water sample and get it analyzed, and then take it to your doctor and ask them what they say.
And I should add another thing there too. If you are on a low sodium diet, reverse osmosis is a really good way to take out sodium chloride or sodium. A lot of things actually. So often, to prevent fouling of the reverse osmosis membranes, I think a lot of dealers will recommend that you have a softener in front of it. That keeps the hard water deposits and the iron off the membrane, and then that should reduce it significantly, like 90%.
Okay. So deep versus a shallow well, we get this question a lot actually, because we use those terms pretty loosely. You know, what's considered a deep well and not a shallow well, and really what's the difference? So it really is somewhat arbitrary, and part of this answer came, my boss answered and sent to me, but because I wanted his opinion. But what's more important really is the hydrogeology and how vulnerable the well or aquifer might be to contamination. So in some cases where if it's more susceptible to surface contamination, you know, we might consider that more of a shallow well. And that's really the terms we're working in here. As a shallow well means that it's more susceptible to the surface versus a deeper well that might not be. And it is arbitrary because if you're in a really sandy area, like in a river bottom, it could be sand at the surface. And even if there's 100 feet of sand and you have your well down, say, 70, 80 feet, it's still fairly susceptible if there's a lot of movement and things can infiltrate. Versus if you have, you know, the same unit, but there's 30 feet of clay, you know, it's a confined aquifer because there's an impermeable zone above it, as it mentions here, then it likely isn't at risk, even though it's the same depth. So, and one other thing I wanted to mention here, in New York, I ran across a bunch of wells that are in bedrock that might be as much as 600 feet deep, but they only have 20 feet of casing. And that's because bedrock's close to the surface, so you seat the casing in the bedrock, and then the rest of your well is just an open hole where the bedrock itself acts as the casing. And that's to take advantage of fractures that might exist that would allow water to run into your well. So it doesn't matter that it's 600 feet deep in that case. What matters is there's only 20 feet of casing. And so if you're only casing it to 20 feet, that means water can get in the well anywhere below 20 feet. And that's much more vulnerable than, say, a sand and gravel well where the screen's at the bottom, say from 76 to 80 feet, and it's an 80-foot well. So it really, there's a lot more that goes into that than just saying whether it's deep or shallow. It's really about the vulnerability, how much casing there is, and where the water's entering the well. Like the well I grew up on, it's only 14 feet deep, and water could come in from really 0 to 14 feet. So it's completely not protective and very vulnerable. So yeah, I guess not to get hung up on what the deep versus shallow issue. So pressure problems. So what causes pressure loss? You know, we get a lot of questions about water pressure, and in fact, we have a video that's, one of our videos is how does my pressure tank work? And in a little over 2 years, it's had, you know, 175,000 hits. So that tells us that a lot of people have pressure issues. And, you know, pressure loss occurs for a bunch of reasons, even friction loss as you push water through a pipe. You know, the inside of the pipe causes friction, and so you have to push with a certain amount of pressure to get water to flow through a pipe in the first place. So if you have a long distance or a lot of pipes going in a lot of ways, that can cause some loss of pressure. But a lot of times it's because either your pressure tank's undersized or your pump's undersized and it can't keep up when you start using it. So as soon as your pressure tank is emptied and your pump kicks on because the pressure's dropped in your tank, and the pump's not big enough to keep up, or for whatever reason, or your well's not conducive enough to keep up, then you start to see a loss of pressure and those sorts of things. But there's other issues that aren't quite so as far as design, but more about your actual system. It could be that you don't have your pressure settings in the right place. So, you know, shut off and kick on pressures for your pressure tank and your pump. A lot of people recommend 30 and 50 or 40 and 60. It could be that, you know, if your tank's in your basement and you have a 3-story house, that you're not going to ever have enough water pressure in that 3rd story unless you have your settings higher. So other things that can happen, I know Dan mentioned if you have treatment equipment, when those get clogged, he mentioned an RO membrane, but especially filters and things like that. If they get clogged or they're restricting flow, that can certainly, even though you think you're pushing a lot of water, it may be coming into your system at a much lower pressure. And even your pipes themselves, you know, if you have iron buildup, we've pulled stand pipes from a large capacity wells that are 12-inch pipes that only have a 2-inch opening left on the inside because of so much iron oxidation that it's all scaled the sides of the pipe up. And there's certainly times where that might be the problem too. So one thing I will mention is the Midwest Plan Service, which is a group of university ag engineering departments in the Midwest that's based at Iowa State, but even includes the University of Illinois, develops a lot of guides for farmers and farm and rural folks. And they have a document, I believe it's number 14 is what they call it, but it's a guide that makes recommendations for sizing a water system based on how far your pump is or your well is from your house, how much lift you need, where all the water is going to go, and how much overall piping you're going to have, so that you make sure and do have enough pressure. And yeah, and it's really meant as much for farming operations or for like cattle and livestock operations as anything else. But it's a good guide, and I pulled several things from that we've used in our class, including a great diagram that shows what a pitless adapter looks like. So it's useful information. Anything to add there, Dan? Before I know you had given me some stuff too.
No, that's good. There's a lot of different reasons, so I think you covered them all.
Okay. Funding programs. Do you know of any federal or state funds for the repair or replacement of private wells? USDA used to have money for this through their rural housing program. Any funds you know currently? Well, USDA still has this program as part of the Farm Bill, and it's implemented through nonprofits. And so it turns out that 3 of the 6 RCAP regions have that loan program: Great Lakes RCAP, the Southeast RCAP, and RCAC, which is the Western RCAP. I've put a link here to RCAC's webpage. And but you can just Google RCAC household water well loan, and you'll find it. Or you can email us too, and we'll send it to you. And NGWA, the National Groundwater Association, has a financing page, and I'll show you that picture in a second, where they list the groups that can potentially provide support. But I looked at it to answer this question, and it looks like it's dated. They only list one of the 3 RCAP regions that actually do this. And for a while, the program was only in certain areas, maybe lower income counties of the state, or some of those things where it's meant to target either elderly or lower income families. And so there's restrictions on some of those things, but you can contact, actually, if you contact any of the RCAP regions, or contact us, we can get you in contact with someone there. I know The RCAP that's in the Northeast, RCAP Solutions, we had a well owner in Pennsylvania ask about it, and I just hooked them up with a person in one of the other regions that does offer loans so they could help them understand if there might be some support for them there. Because we're not involved with that part of it, but the RCAC, for instance, in the western 15 states has provided this program for many years, and it's used extensively, especially with the drought they had, the last few years. So this is the web page that's on National Groundwater Association's wellowner.org page, and if you just say wellowner.org financing, this will come up in Google, and there's some information here in this list. It says Arkansas, the Water Well Trust. That list goes on for a little bit, but again, it doesn't have everything here, but it does describe the program. It takes you to a page where you can apply. As far as it's a USDA web page, and there's some information there. This is the RCAC web page, and I probably should have included these URLs on this page, but they do have a water well loan grant program. It's very robust. There's a link there you can apply. You probably have to be in their region to apply from them, but they probably have they probably can give you more information, and they have staff for that. So I don't know of any other programs. There are certainly programs that might help you with sampling or with abandoning a well, or even with, those two things. I know Iowa has a program for that, but I don't know of any others than the USDA program for household water well, either a loan or grant, depending on your situation, and it can be for replacement, adding treatment, all those sorts of things. So it's pretty useful for some people. Okay, if you're a new homeowner, how do you know you're on a well? So this sounds like a silly question to some of you, but it really isn't. I've had a number of community water supplies tell me that they've got calls from people who are complaining about their water, and when they look them up on the map, they're not on their city water supply, and they went out to their house and showed them they have a well. So it does happen. We had a professor here on campus who moved from New York City, bought a house out in the country, and 3 months after living there, they had a well problem, and it's the first time he really realized his wife had came first and bought the house and all that stuff, and he was just not up to speed, if you will, on what was going on. So, but in most states, the well information has to be disclosed either at the property sale or it comes up during an inspection. And, some of those are just best practices. I guess you don't have to have an inspection, but I don't know why you'd buy a house if you didn't. But in states like New Jersey, if it has a well, you're required to have the state come and collect a sample at the property sale, and the results are given to the buyer and the seller, no one else. So in a lot of cases, it should be pretty clear. But if you don't have, you're not sure, or maybe you're on a rental property and you don't know where your water's coming from, then first thing I do is call your community water supply. If you're close enough to a community or in a community where you're not sure or on the edge of town, your community water department can tell you if your address is part of their system or not. And Dan had pointed out to me, he goes, well, ask them if they pay a water bill. Do you pay a water bill? If you do, then you're on city water. Unless it's some arrangement you have. If you're on a shared well, that's the other possibility. But we certainly see cases where, one side of the street there's city water, on the other side of the street, people are on wells, and the community boundary is actually that street. So, but if the last thing would be just ask your neighbors. If your neighbors are on city water or have wells, you're likely to have the same thing if you're on the same side of the street. So, but if you just purchased a home, this is a new homeowner, then I'd go back and contact your realtor and or the realtor for the seller and have them find out, because they'll know. And so there's a number of options for you if you really don't know for sure what you're up against here. Okay, I guess I'll take this, Dan.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Is my well at risk for nitrite or nitrite contamination if I live close to a farm or farming community? Well, it really depends, but it's always worth testing to be sure. Because even if you have a deeper well or a well that's well protected at the surface and it has a confining layer that protects the aquifer, if you're in a farming area, the nitrate's being used, or maybe land application of manure. So it's certainly possible you could have a breach in your casing or anything else. That's why we recommend even people that have great wells that have just been drilled, you should still test annually. And we certainly see cases where that's been a problem. So if your well is vulnerable to surface influence, then it's more likely you'd see elevated nitrates in a farming situation. And, and it's less likely if it's not. So the bottom line is the best way to find out is to test. And nitrate is so ubiquitous in our environment that there's a certain amount, and I know in Illinois we consider 3 ppm as background where the standard's 10. But if we see it higher than that, then we realize there's probably something influence in the well. But it really depends on where you live. So, if there's direct nitrate contamination, you'll know it when you sample. And so that's what I recommend. There's really no way to get rid of it. So, in the source, if you will, in the aquifer. So I use this from one of the other presentations we given, but it was talked about and it was asked in a different way. But I want to talk about well disinfection because it's something that everyone has to do when they have a coliform hit or bacteria hit. And a lot of people do things like, my driller told me to put a cup of bleach down the well every month, or I disinfect my well every spring and fall just because. So you really shouldn't chlorinate your well unless you need to. And the only way to know if you need to is to sample and have a positive hit for bacteria. If you don't have bacteria in your well, don't chlorinate your well. There's no reason to just do it on a schedule. It doesn't help. It actually can harm some of the parts of your pump or the seals for your pitless and those sorts of things. So there's an approach to actually disinfecting your well. You shouldn't use straight bleach. Some people put straight Clorox down their well. That's a bad idea because it is harmful to well components. It's too concentrated. So we've looked, there's probably over 100 different local, state, regional health and educational entities that have developed here's our brochure for how you should disinfect your well. We looked at a lot of those, and I mean a lot. And we chose the Minnesota Department of Health's guide that they developed in 2010 or 2011 as the best resource for people to use. It's the one that I recommend and send to people because it's the most comprehensive. It has pictures and diagrams and walks you through it step by step. So we link to it. If you go, I showed earlier those 8 to 10 links for other documents related to each lesson. So if you go under our resources for lesson 10, you'll see water treatment under water treatment solutions. You'll see a link to this document, and that's what we would recommend using if you need to disinfect your well. So, and that's just the cover of the top of it. But like I said, it's got a diagram. You're supposed to mix to a certain concentration, and the way to do that is you have to do a little math to figure out how deep your well is and how big the casing is, so you know how much water to put in it and to mix it at the right concentration, so that you're putting enough in to kill the bacteria, but not so much that it's going to be harmful to your components. And and as I even tell you about, if it's been a long time, you could dislodge things, and so you need to, if you follow the step-by-step, it's a pretty good guide. It even has information at the end about what to do with your treatment equipment, and that you can contact the Water Quality Association, WQA.org, for information on specific types of treatment equipment and knowing whether or not you should take those offline or remove the cartridge or whatever, so that you're not going to damage your treatment device. So we had a question about algae. So how do I treat my well and what with? I have to clean algae. I think it's algae from my shower and sink faucets in the toilet. So Dan is going to answer the rest of this question, but I wanted to point out that algae needs sunlight to live. And when I looked up algae in groundwater, because I'd never heard of it, not today, but I had this question once before, similar, there's nothing to suggest this is really possible for algae to live in your well. We had a person in New York who had like a summer home or a cabin, and he said he had algae in his well, and he actually had a filter, and he took the filter in and had it analyzed. It was actually algae. So I started asking him about his well. It turned out his well is 15 feet from a lake, and he's in an area where the bedrock's right at the land surface. So I told him what is likely going on there is his well is pumping right from the lake, basically. It's running through 15 feet of a crack in the rock to get to his well case, to well boring. So, and that's the only way you'd have algae in your well. So I know Dan had some other suggestions or ideas. So go ahead, Dan.
Okay. Yeah, that's if it were algae, that's what I tried to say at the end of my answer to something similar, like, hey, look, see if there's a point of entry. Like, it's got to be shallow enough, and the crack in the bedrock is a perfect example of just there's a source nearby. It's got a direct conduit into the well, and so it's coming from that surface water supply rather than actually growing down in the well. And if you did have it, there probably are ways to treat it. It's best to talk to a dealer. I assume it's going to be some type of a disinfection, like a chlorination would kill things. But some other thoughts I had were, could it be iron buildup? We're used to thinking of iron as being just a orange colored or brown colored, but if you look at your tub, if you've got a lot of hard water deposits, they tend to be like a tan or off-white. If you mix that with some oranges or browns, I think it could have the appearance of algae, maybe a greenish. If you had some copper corrosion, it tends to be bluish green. If you have other things that are falling out of solution or just suspended in the water, it might look like algae, but it might be something else. So if it's some of those other things, like precipitated iron, you could just probably add a sediment filter to get rid of it if it's already precipitated. If you were pretty sure it was iron, you could add a softener or an iron filter. Just be aware they also softeners remove the hardness too and increase sodium, like we mentioned before. So.
All right. Yeah, and you can always get it analyzed.
Yeah, should have said that. Yeah, right.
Yeah, I didn't think of it either until just now, but because that's what the other person did, and I'd look for a different reason if it actually turned out to be that. I just don't believe it would be. So, because I couldn't find anything in the literature at all.
I looked a bit. I really didn't see much discussion of algae in well water.
Nothing definitive for sure. So.
Yeah.
Lead concerns. So I live in, if I live in older farming houses or communities, how do I check for lead contamination, and is this something I can do at home? It really isn't something you could do at home on your own. You should contact your local health department if you're concerned, not only about testing your water for lead, but also about other sources of lead if it's an older home. Because there's a lot of other sources for lead, as you know, well, there are. And I believe some of the resources that are on our lead page, which I showed you earlier, may have, and Jennifer may know this better than I do, but have links to like some of the CDC things on lead that talk about, not water, but other sources. So, and so just to mention here again, we do have a recorded webinar on lead in premise plumbing and through your private well. And it talks about all the issues you really need to be aware of if that's a concern and a possible source. And I refer you to that. It's a lot more detail. And if you really, if you have lead pipes or a lot of older lead solder, then it's worth your time to go through that. So, and then if you have questions, you can always email us. And we have, I'm not a lead expert. None of us here are, but we know enough to be dangerous. And so what I would do is contact some of the folks I know who are experts and ask them to help us answer those questions.
Hey, Steve, just
go ahead.
I wasn't sure what they're getting at is I'm just thinking about it right now. If they're looking at their plumbing, I mean, there are some guidelines about looking at your plumbing and looking at the color of the plumbing. Well, looking at the composition first, if it's metal plumbing or like a gray metal that you might scratch. If you know you've got a really old home and you know you can, like, if you've ever had a piece of lead and it'll make a mark on a paper and it looks kind of dull. There are some indications like that. I don't have them all memorized, and you might search for something like that, but you could also obviously look and see if you've got PVC plumbing. If you've got white or off-white plastic plumbing, then the only real concern you might have would be at the actual taps. So I don't know if they were getting at some of those things, but there are some guidelines for looking at the actual pipes and doing somewhat of a bit yourself, but I don't. It doesn't replace testing.
Sure. Okay. So that's what we have for the questions that were asked in advance. It's almost 2:30 Central Time. We do have a few questions that have come in, and so I'm going to pull those over here. Hopefully you can all see those. You see those okay, Dan?
Yeah, I can see them.
All right. So the first one is, what if your well is located inside the home? That's unfortunate, but we do see that down in the basement or whatever. And, what it means probably is that your pump is not down in the well, but instead it's a jet pump or a suction pump that's also in the basement. And, there's certainly no way to, if you have a problem, if it's got a well screen or if there's a breach in the pipe, there's no way to do anything to fix that. You really just have to fill it in once there's a problem. But if somehow you have a submersible pump, which doesn't make sense, there'd be no way to pull the pump or any of those things either. So that's why on that setback diagram, it talks about being so far away from a building and all those things, or any kind of power lines. That's so a drill rig or a contractor's truck can pull up over the well and actually pull your pump up if they need to replace the pump without anything else. So, being inside your home doesn't mean anything otherwise, as long as, if it's open, the whole top is open. I might have some kind of lid put on it, just so, I'm assuming you don't have mice or anything inside your home, but, if you live in the country, a lot of times mice can get in. We sure had them when I was a kid. But you just want to protect it the same way and make sure that there's no way for things to get in it. And I don't know if that answers your question, or if you had something more specific you were interested in. But if you do, go ahead and ask another question. And in the meantime, I'll let Dan answer the second one because I know he knows how to answer this one.
We often get a lot of questions. I guess I was redundant there, but we get a lot of questions about black particles. It's often not really magnesium, but a lot of times it's attributed to manganese. It's another cation. It sounds similar, but it's actually a different element. So a lot of times it's attributed to manganese, which can stain it. I believe the secondary maximum contaminant level is 50 parts per billion. But I do want to add that I think it's often overlooked, but a lot of times it can be iron too. I've seen iron when it's wet, and like if you've got one of those see-through sediment filter, it'll be really about as black as you can get, and it'll cake up a filter really colored black. After the filter dries out, it'll dry out to like a darker brown or medium shade of brown. Also, I think they'll attribute sulfides. If you've got a lot of sulfide in your water, it may be it may be iron sulfide that's precipitating out. It would be my guess. So I think it could be either manganese or iron is first guesses. This is in the raw water stream. There's just other occasions. I've read some stuff about, if it's downstream from treatment equipment or a pressure tank, it could be bits of a torn bladder or something, but I don't think that's the usual explanation.
All right, thanks, Dan. Yeah, if anyone has any other questions, again, you can always email us, And that email address, which I will type here real quick, because I didn't think about it, or Jennifer can, is info@privatewellclass.org. And you can also get to that from our webpage, privatewellclass.org. Down at the bottom, there's a place to click on email. And so that's what we have for today. I hope if you have any, again, let us know. And this will be, this is being recorded, so it will be up on our website, if not by the end of the week, by Monday next week. And you can see all of our webinars there. And yeah, we appreciate any feedback you have. And thank you for attending.